Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast, a special edition podcast for Geopolitical Futures' favorite holiday, April Fool's Day. Happy April Fool's Day. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm the Director of Analysis. Today, joining me is Cole Altum, our Managing Editor. Say hello, Cole.
Hello.
And Phillip Orchard, who is one of our rockstar analysts. Say hello, Phillip.
Howdy.
That is a fortuitous howdy because we are gathered here to discuss a piece once that Cole actually wrote. So the tables are a little bit turned. Now I can pepper Cole with questions to try and divine exactly what he means instead of the other way around, which I don't know if you're looking forward to it, Cole. I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to cryptic answers and to see if you ask as dumb questions as I do. So
I'm looking forward to both.
Yeah. So we hope you brought. Cole, did you bring us any peaches or any fruit, or are we doing this podcast without peaches?
No peaches, no canned peaches, no unauthorized cinnamon.
Okay, well, if it isn't already clear yet, if it isn't already clear from the title of this podcast or the inside jokes we've already made, we're talking today about Deadwood because it's April Fool's, and the first April Fool's that GPF was alive, we did a geopolitical analysis of Game of Thrones. Last year, readers might remember that we did a geopolitical analysis of Dune. This year, it is Deadwood's turn. If you don't like Deadwood, if you haven't seen Deadwood, if you don't want to hear us apply geopolitics to this very famous and wonderful HBO show that I highly recommend you go watch, you can turn off right now. But if you are interested in this, Cole, why don't you share with the readers, why was Deadwood something that you wanted to apply geopolitics to?
Well, as you mentioned, this is our third round of these. We did Game of Thrones, then we did Dune. Game of Thrones, for everybody who has seen the show, which is everybody, that's a no-brainer. It lends itself really, really well to this sort of analysis. You talk about all the little constituent, countries and kingdoms of Westeros and all these historical analogs, right? Karth is Carthage and the Dothraki are the Mongols and all this other stuff. It just lends itself really, really well to that. Now we talk about a lot of other things in that piece. But primarily, it was sort of this cool survey of political geography, right? Contrast that with Dune from last year. We talk a lot about the politics of the Imperium and how it's sort of organized and its history and how it came into being. But the primary focus was on the resource of spice. And I believe we did a podcast last year on this, so people can kind of get into the details of that if they want to listen to that one too. But to answer your question, those are two different, very different aspects of geopolitics. And so I was kind of thinking about doing one, and I wanted to kind of explore a lesser explored aspect of geopolitics, which is the decisions of geopolitical leaders, right? Sometimes in geopolitical discourse, it's a little tempting to say that the leaders don't actually matter. That's really not entirely true. Geopolitics does sort of downplay those leaders to some degree, but ultimately they're calling shots, and it's especially important early on in a nation state's in its development, right? So Deadwood, there's heavy politicking. It's a very, very political show, but if for those of you who've seen it, it's a very different kind. It's a very different kind of politicking, and again, it's about. It became sort of an allegory for statecraft and for nation building and for all these other things. So that's kind of why I wanted to write about it. I really love the show, obviously. And it's just one of these cool cult classic TV shows that kind of ended abruptly years ago. I want to say over a decade ago, that is now kind of by popular demand. It's highly touted reprisal. And so in about a month or so, HBO is going to kind of tie it all together with a movie that never really came and will hopefully satisfy all of its many rabid fans.
It's different than Game of Thrones, and it's different than Dune also in this way, because Game of Thrones and Dune are both completely fictional universes. And I thought you actually did a really good job splitting the difference here, because Deadwood, of course, is actually a real town. It was real. It's on the map. I believe there is probably still a town of Deadwood, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, it's still there.
Yeah.
And the HBO show blends a lot of fact with fiction, and the line between where fact begins and where fiction ends is pretty blurry. And so you had a double challenge in this piece, because on the one hand, you had to deal with a lot of real American history, and you had to talk about the geopolitics of manifest destiny and of the gold rush and of the frontier and all these other things, but then also to interact with the more fantastical elements that the TV show brought in.
Yeah, I actually had to do research for this piece of fanfic. That sucks, man. That was hard. But but like, to your point, it was necessary, right? A lot of the characters in the TV show are real, but that's kind of where it stops after a while. A lot of what happens there is somewhat fictionalized. But again, one of the cooler parts about it, I think, and I guess I should have mentioned this earlier, is for anybody who's not aware of it, the central conceit of the plot of the show basically is that there is a gold rush in this little town, and the town was technically on Indian territory, but the United States was in the process of annexing that territory, right? So it was in legal limbo. Um, so the central plot conceit was that it was completely lawless. Like it is a lawless land. It took that Western trope that you see in a lot of movies and TV shows of past years and kind of really exaggerated it. Now, reality, probably it wasn't quite that lawless. They kind of set up some norms and customs and traditions that had kind of existed to that time. But that was the central draw. And that's why, without being too direct or being too obtuse with it, the show it just like drips with political theory, right? There's all sorts of different subtle allusions to Locke and Hobbes and Marx and Hume. It's so that's what I mean by like the politics or the geopolitics of development. This is all metaphorical. It's all an allegory of how communities or nations, if you will, kind of come together and create the institutions that govern each other and create laws and fend off enemies and all these other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's so wonderful about the show, and I think I'm probably stealing this from something else, but like so many of our favorite shows are about like how society functions and fails, and how the institutions, like it shows like The Wire shows how like the institutions that are established fall apart or become the machinery of them sort of like grinds together, and how it affects everyone. Yeah, well, in Deadwood's how these things are organized in the first place, and so yeah, it was a completely lawless place, and yet over time throughout the series, these people the society comes up with laws, they come up with institutions, but it's all shaped by these broader forces, which is the United States, the its wars with the Sioux, the geography of the landscape, and all that sort of stuff. And I thought you did a really nice job of tracing that out.
Well, Cole, I wonder if you might talk. I was curious if you would talk about is the extent to which you think Deadwood is real, or if Deadwood was really just a laboratory for thinking about these ideas.
It's a good question, and it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. So I note in the piece, I owe a lot to a really great book written about the subject, written about Deadwood by a historian named Watson Parker, and it's really really great. It's a really fun book to read. It's historical, like it's a work of history. He was an academic, but it's very folksy and like very very raconteurish or whatever. It's really great. And one of his central kind of theses in that is that Deadwood's one of those cities, and he's from the area, so he can talk about it much more authoritatively than I can. I'm just quoting him. One of the central theses is that there was so much lore and so much legend kind of surrounding it that always sort of obscured the truth. And while there are some quote unquote historical records of early settlers and early prospectors, you really got to take a lot of that with a grain of salt. It's just one of those things that it is real, and like so many other kind of figures inside Deadwood and out, like Wild Bill Hickok or whatever, the legend doesn't always comport with reality, right? So on the one hand, a lot about this is real. The Sioux were there. The Sioux War was real. The Battle of Little Bighorn was real, and the United States' desire to spread westward, manifest destiny, all that other garbage, that was real. It was also real that the United States found gold on the territory that they had deeded to the Sioux, and they were like, "Hey, actually, you can't stay here anymore. We're going to stay here now." All that's real. The socioeconomic conditions of the 1860s and the 1870s that impelled people to kind of like move and seek their fortune in some of these other untamed frontiers, that's all real. Then it starts getting hazy, right? We do have some record of who owned what claim above discovery, and we have records of people opening businesses there. We have records of generally how much money some of these claims and later some of the mills actually produced. And it wasn't that long ago. I mean, we're talking about the 1870s, but it gets tricky because in any gold rush town, this happened in San Francisco and it's happened in some other places. People hype it up, and people in nearby cities and nearby settlements, they kind of hype it up because it's never really the prospectors who flourish in this kind of environment. Or not never, but it's rarely. More often, it's like the Levi Strausses of the world who make a lot of money in service to these companies. It's not all that different from modern day fracking. I mean, so a lot of these oil companies, they'll make some money, but the people making a killing are some of these servicing companies who are doing the fracking and providing the lights and the logistics and the porta potties and all these other things.
I was gonna say, or the Walmart just providing the
yeah, exactly, right. So
the everyday utilities,
that was something interesting I found out in the story too. Again, these are all very generalized numbers. It's kind of hard to tell, but there is some actual historical accounting for it. Some guy kind of generally guessed that there were maybe around 10,000 or so people kind of in the Deadwood area. But like a little over 10% or so were actually working gold claims, right? A lot of them were just wage workers. Some of them owned the land, some of them didn't. Some of them were just kind of like hanging out and drinking, and some people were making a mint as saloon keepers and brothel keepers and hardware businesses and whatnot. So there is some account for that. It's just to say that this particular time in American history, and especially I think with literature, fiction or nonfiction of the West, it's a very like hyper idealized time in American lore. All these like gunslingers from back then, none of them really killed as many people as they are purported to, and some of them were not like righteous lawmen. They were just like dudes looking to get by, right? So I'm really rambling. It's a long way to answer your question. It's just in a place like that, it is very hard to separate what is and what was not. But a lot of the characters that appeared in the series, many of them, were real. Wild Bill Hickok was real. Calamity Jane was real. There's records for Bullock and Swearengen and some of these other people. So some were definitely fictionalized, and what they actually did while there is highly fictionalized. They took very, very wide liberties. Does that kind of answer your question? I could probably go on for another 45 horrible minutes.
I think thematically it was true. We don't know exactly how the power struggles and the processes of Deadwood making itself into an organized society and trying to stave off the different forces that were trying to dominate it played out. But I'm guessing that the themes of the show and how generally how these things played out were pretty accurate.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue for the second part of this question.
I just want to do an aside on the topic of historical accuracy. I read something a long piece studying the language that was used in the show and whether and what it said and whatever, and it was dialogue on Deadwood is it's one of the wonderful features. I mean, it's so rich, and famously it's incredibly vulgar. There's something like
easily the most profane show ever filmed, and it's not even close. They've done like mathematical studies of profanities, per minute. It's really
no. It was. I actually took notes. It was like 0.98 F words per minute of a show. But it was kind of funny because one of the things that was pointed out by critics, after the show came on, was that a lot of the cursing was actually not historically accurate.
Not at all.
At least in the specific words, because a lot of them had never been like used before or something. A lot of the terminology, and they asked the show's creator David Milch about this, and he's like, we tried to we use the lingo of the day, but all the characters just came out sounding like Yosemite Sam.
Yep, I think I read the exact same thing you did. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was like, we had to update it a little bit.
It did have that reputation of being like a very sort of in a very profane place in its own right. It's just they couldn't modernize it, and they actually make some subtle references to that in the show. There's one where Farnham and Walcott are talking to each other. And he's like, "Oh man, I guess I'm shit out of luck." He's like, "Did they talk that way back then?"
Yeah.
So it's very self-aware.
But funnily enough, is the show is apparently liberally sprinkled with like ancient British and Chinese curse words, which I feel like it says something that vulgar language of the Brits and of the Chinese has much more staying power. It's still
Right.
relevant today
Right.
than what us Americans,
But
how we
and that is not
express our.
that's not to undersell the rest of the writing. This is, I like, my opinion, like the best written show on TV ever. It's just so it's so florid and so lyrical. It sounds like really really cool variations on like some of those Civil War letters back home that you hear on like a Ken Burns documentary. Oh, there's a lot of swearing. It's really
Yeah,
great,
it's one of those
really
shows
great
where
swear.
I find myself rewinding scenes over and over just to
Yeah,
relish the richness and the poetry of the dialogue. And also because that's where so many of these subtle power shifts
right.
play out and stuff. But it's something I always tell people is especially any scene with Al Swearengen, like the main anti-hero of the show, like watch it with the subtitles on. You'll thank me.
I strongly disagree with that. I think figuring it out is like half the fun. But Swearengen, I never double checked this to make sure it's actually true. But supposedly a lot of his dialogue, monologues, I guess, were written in iambic pentameter. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but that's kind of.
Oh, I believe it. I
But
mean,
that I believe
it's too perfect.
yeah, that
It's so good. Yeah.
that it is believable. Sort of attests to sort of how they conceived of some of the dialogue and the monologues in this show, right? So
Back to geopolitics.
I would say that the British and the Chinese had hundreds of years to develop their curse words in the way that Americans have not yet. So maybe we're just at the very beginning of American curse words.
Yeah, it's very American. We're always, reinventing ourselves. That is the theme of Deadwood, compared to these old, tradition bound, hamstrung by their, with their language and everything, societies.
Yeah, but that's actually the exact thing I wanted to ask, which was, is this show fundamentally American? Because we have a lot of listeners to this podcast who are not Americans, and a lot of people who come to GPF who are not Americans who read our analysis. And I'm wondering, and I would pose the question to both of you: do you think that Deadwood is in some way uniquely American? Is it a uniquely American story? It's obviously set in the context of the West and in United States history, but do you think the themes that it develops are uniquely American, or are they broadly applied to, first of all, human beings in general, and second of all, to political institutions in particular? Is this a show about specifically the political institutions of the United States or of any kind of frontier state, or is it something that can actually be thought of as applied to just about anything?
I'll go first, and I'll go quick. I mean, I do think that power. One of the show's strengths is it shows that power is power, and one of the realities of the frontier is that like all the trappings of institutions and society and cultural norms and get stripped away pretty quickly. Yeah, everyone's polite to each other, and then everyone's laying dead in the mud in the street. So that doesn't make you uniquely American, except for that the time and place. But I'm sure that exact same story has played out time and time again.
yeah, I'd say it's actually pretty universal. I don't think you need to be initiate in American folklore to kind of appreciate this. Kind of like, as Phillip said, the power dynamics are universal. Things like corruption and bribery and capital, brute force. These things are all pretty easily understood, and kind of like as a weird microcosm of that. Swearengen and Mr. Wu, who cannot speak to each other because Mr. Wu speaks only in Chinese.
Except for one word.
Yeah, well, yeah, we could repeat that over and over again, but probably shouldn't. But they can make themselves understood because they understand. Well, they understand a more like universal language, which is like sort of like power and violence and some of these things that are in this series in spades. So in that sense, I think it's very universal. There's nothing uniquely American about expansion. There's nothing uniquely American necessarily about displacing indigenous communities. Europe did that, they just did it a long, long time ago, right? There's nothing unique about the power, like the oppressive power of capital sometimes, and how that conveys more power than it should sometimes. So all of that, I think, is pretty universal. Sorry, were you going to say something, Phil?
I was just going to say that maybe what's uniquely American about it, or at least relatively compared, because so much of American history, because America is so young, so much of its history was this story. Was
Sure.
unfolding of Manifest Destiny, and like the just these crazy people, pushing forward into the West to do it. There's not a lot of other countries out there. I mean, I'm probably going to insult somebody here. I'm thinking, except for maybe Australia, that have had similar experiences on a similar timescale.
Right. The one thing there are some aspects of the show that I think are well, maybe not uniquely American, but I think they translate less perhaps to a foreign audience. And because remember, this is an HBO series, so it is a medium of entertainment, right? And so the Western as a genre of entertainment or of literature or cinema or however you want to define it, like all genres, it has its own specific tropes, and it has the plot devices that it tends to rely on. And one of the cool things I think about Deadwood is that I appreciate any piece of genre, literature, or cinema or whatever that can be a piece of genre and also subvert that a little bit. And Deadwood does do that because, again, the lawlessness of the American frontier is a trope for time eternal. And what Deadwood did was kind of build kind of a political theology around it, right? And you don't see that in John Wayne movies necessarily. You see like a noble sheriff doing right, but in Deadwood, there really are no heroes or villains. There's only strategic interests for the most part. So you see some people doing really good things, you see some doing bad things, some for good reasons and some for bad reasons. And so, like, Deadwood does have a sheriff archetype in Seth Bullock, but as Ryan, our friend Ryan, pointed out once, his only two emotions are guilt and rage, and you don't see that in some of like the shinier westerns of Shane and some of these older ones. So, and you don't understand, like, so even though the character doesn't last very long, Wild Bill Hickok is like a really cool character because he's just kind of like, there's a lot of like ennui and boredom and unfulfilled self-actualization, and so it's hard to understand why he's such a compelling character if you kind of don't really know his backstory. So I'm sure people in Poland or whatever may not be super familiar with him or with some of those literary tropes that the series is playing off of. So that's probably not quite as transmutable, I think, to a foreign audience. But like we watch foreign movies and foreign TV, so you can kind of pick up on some of these things and learn as you go. But yeah, back to your question, Jacob. I think what makes it good is that these themes are universal, and you could understand this sort of stuff. But there might be some subtle things that you're going to miss out on. I mean, like, you don't need to be a South Dakota historian to enjoy this show by any means.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it when you talked about it subverting the genre in a sense, because I think when you think about most US television shows or movies or the entire media industry, the United States usually stands in for freedom or for justice or for some combination of freedom and justice. And the whole premise of Deadwood is that there are Americans who are trying to get as far away as possible from the United States as possible in order to have freedom, because their freedom is the ability to not be defined by laws. And the entire time, whether it's Swearengen or Hearst or this, that, or the other person, there is this looming force of the United States that is sort of lurking in the background and wants to apply its laws to this area. And they want that imminent loss of their freedom because of the profit that gets associated with it. But you have this brief moment in time where Deadwood is like the equivalent of a small, tiny country bordering this massive behemoth and is trying to secure some maximum level of, I don't know if you call it freedom or prosperity or self-actualization or whatever you want to get there before the United States comes in and gives what Deadwood, I think, the United States stands for law, not necessarily freedom or justice or righteousness or all these other things.
I would take it a step further. Like, no, that's a very great point, and I would take it a step further by saying, like, again, you want to be careful by applying antagonist or protagonist in a series like this. But I'd say the United States is an antagonist in this show. It is seen almost as an oppressor, and later on does act in cahoots with, like, the avatar George Hearst, the avatar for capitalism and crony capitalism and even colonialism, and they're like working together. So, like, I mean, I think it's a great point. I would take it even further. Like, the United States is like not really the good guy in this show to some degree or another, anyway.
So just on the universality of the themes of Deadwood, the first time I watched the show, I was living in a tent in post Katrina New Orleans, like a couple months after the hurricane, and I remember I was watching it on DVDs, like on my laptop, and that I'd gotten from like the only Blockbuster still standing in town. And basically I was like living in this little community that was like, post Katrina New Orleans was basically a gold rush. This big tent community had squatter community, probably about almost 1,000 people had sprouted up in City Park, New Orleans. And like, it wasn't filled with people who had lost their houses in the storm. It was filled primarily with people who had come to New Orleans to try to make money off the disaster. I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way, but if you're an out of work roofer somewhere and sure, you're like, wow, that town needs a lot of roofs, let's go see if I can, and then, go make some money. And everyone was to do menial tasks or whatever. You could actually make quite a bit. But it was a very lawless place. I'm not going to get too deep into the stories that happened there, but like, I think it was there was some gunfights. There was more than one occasion where I found myself standing between two people, like holding pointing guns at each other, and I'm like, come on, guys! Like, I was just a naive kid, but like let's all get along. But it was, dialogue was not quite as rich as it was in Deadwood, and we weren't digging gold out of the Black Hills was probably a little bit more.
You weren't speaking in iambic pentameter, I guess.
Well, I was, but I don't want to brag. I really was out of place. It was kind of fun. But yeah, I mean, we weren't getting gold money, but digging refrigerators out of rotted out houses in the in the Ninth Ward or whatever. Yeah, you can get $20 a pop for taking it to the dump. So, but the camp itself was what was fascinating, because it was in a process of organizing itself. And the city, was had no ability at that point to regulate it or whatever. And especially as people started coming back, moving back into town, kind of appalled, didn't want this squatter camp on their doorstep. And it's kind of in a little bit nicer neighborhood in New Orleans. And so what their solution was to send in a group of guys. They were actually like Alaskan king crab fishermen for some reason. The kind of guys that can just smell opportunity and money and stuff. And they, several of them were millionaires to basically kind of run the camp and regulate it. And, and somehow I ended up on their side and making good with them. And so the six of us basically, we lived in slightly nicer, well, they lived in really nice trailers. I lived in a slightly nicer tent. And every day we would go out and try to basically get people to pay rent. And make sure that everyone was applying or complying with different regulations that they were coming up with to sort of impose some sense of order and everything on the camp. This all happened in a 4-month window, and very quickly it all went away. But it was this brief callback in American, to an earlier time in American history that this is what 2006, I guess. So it can the themes still play out today. We even had a group of Native Americans who had set up teepees. They were a group of White Mountain Apaches had been brought to town, told they were going to make money. The contractor, whoever, had dumped them in the park and then split with their half their belongings or whatever, and so they were kind of stuck there, doing the same thing everything else. And they set up a bunch of teepees, and they did not want to pay rent. And I didn't blame them. Or did not want to and would not, especially when it was me showing up and asking yeah, we need your $15 for the month. Anyway, all this stuff can happen any day.
That actually touches on a point it's worth noting about the show too. Structurally, this thing went on for 3 seasons and it ended abruptly. So that's 3 different years of 13 episodes. One of the really cool things about it was that this takes place in a very short amount of time, from start to finish. Deadwood in the series world and in the time of the show, very, very quick. We're talking weeks, maybe months, and there are some parts of the 3rd season where the whole 13 episodes, 13 hours, is really just a matter of a couple days. Some episodes pick up immediately, to the second where the last one ended up, and that actually does kind of comport with reality. It was
fast.
Yeah, things sort out fast. It started kind of in the spring, and people started flocking to Deadwood over the course of a couple weeks, and then not very long after it was annexed. which I just think is kind of structurally kind of a cool thing about the show as well.
All right, well, now it's time for me to venture on some dangerous ground here, because the last time I raised the point or question that I'm about to raise, Cole and I ended up screaming at each other at a bar in Austin while drinking mezcal with Phillip trying to referee, sort of like you were trying to do in the Katrina camp, I guess.
Yeah, so basically this right now, yeah.
I'm pretty typecast.
But you already kind of alluded to it, Cole. You sort of already conceded the point earlier when you said that there are no heroes in Deadwood. But I feel like for you, Al Swearengen is the hero of Deadwood, and it's because he wants to build this community in a way that is more organic. Whereas I see very little difference between Hearst and Swearengen, and see them both operating under a certain set of constraints, and that ultimately they were basically two sides of the same coin, and that Hearst just happened to have more power. So tell me why I'm wrong.
We don't really the gulf between our disagreements is not really as wide as the alcohol made it seem. So what I mean by no heroes and no villains is that, like, we need to separate this from Deadwood, the TV show that is a piece of entertainment, and giving this the quote unquote real life treatment that we give it in the piece, right? So as a piece of entertainment, Swearengen absolutely is like the cool anti-hero guy that you are rooting for in no uncertain terms. And he's one of the coolest characters that HBO has ever come up with, right? And in that sense, Hearst is absolutely the antagonist. But that's not geopolitics, right? So for the piece, I wanted to kind of get away from what the series conveyed and think about what are these guys' objectives? What do they want to do? Right. So it'd actually be a mistake to say that, Swearengen really wants an organic community, because really no communities are organic, and certainly Deadwood wasn't. It only existed because white people, kicked the Indians off the land because they wanted the gold, right? So it was organic for that particular time, but not generally organic, and really, in that sense, not any different from what Hearst was going to do to Swearengen. But the point I make in the piece is that, and this goes to kind of the heart of why I wanted to write this, that Swearengen's cool. We're rooting for Swearengen, right? But it was his interest that dictated his actions. He wanted to get the camp annexed on his terms, and he thought he could do that because he was making money as a pimp and a saloon keeper and doing all these other things. Organized crime, basically, he's an organized crime boss. But he kind of thought he could make more money by being part of the U.S. system than he could by just keep doing what he was doing. And so to do that, he needed to do certain things, right? He needed to maintain the reputation of the camp. So he totally murdered people. He and Hearst both murdered people. But when Swearengen did it, he kind of had to cover up his crime a little bit, because he didn't want to completely sully the camp's reputation or tarnish its image, right? Because he needed it to look good for the eventual annexation, right? And so that's why he also enlists members of the community to his cause. It's why he started off as enemies with Bullock, the sheriff, and then got right by him. He had the opportunity to straight up murder him, and then he said, "I decide not to do this because that would go against my interest." Same with trying to steal Alma Garrett's gold claim. He said, "This is antithetical to my interest. I will be able to rob the United States and Yankton, where the provisional legislature was, blind if I keep doing this," right? It's why he relied on Mr. Wu. It's also why he had this local spy network. Why he flipped Adams, who was originally aligned with Yankton and now firmly in Swearengen's camp. So when I say I don't think he's a hero, but I think the central point is his interests happen to align with the camp's interests. And in time, I think he does develop sort of a fondness for the camp. But however sincere that was, it was ultimately a consequence of his decision to align his interests with it, right? Whereas Hearst and his sort of stool pigeon Tolliver in the show, they didn't really have to worry about that because Hearst was more powerful, right? He had much more capital. He had more guns. He had the U.S. government in his pocket ready to basically do whatever he wanted them to do, because they would profit from it pretty handsomely too. So to your point, Jacob, had Swearengen been in that position, I think I agree that maybe he wouldn't have decided to do things any differently than Hearst had. but they were in different positions. And my point of the piece is that where you sit kind of dictates where you stand on things to some degree. And I think that's a function of the institutions we build, the governmental institutions we build. And you see that time and again in real life, and also in the fictional worlds of places like Deadwood and The Wire and Game of Thrones and things like that. So that's what I mean when I say individual leaders do sometimes matter, and the choices they make matter, because had Swearengen done what Hearst did, right? Had he like aggregated all the gold mines, which he maybe could have done. Let's pretend that he could have done. It's debatable whether he could have, but let's say he could have. Had he done that, then maybe Deadwood would have survived basically like the incursion of Hearst and like the moneyed interest that basically made it into a metaphor for a colony. They effectively colonized Deadwood. Had Swearengen been more ambitious than that, had he not just wanted to sit back and say, all I want to do is make my way and rob these people blind and make a lot of money doing it, then that might have affected the decision one way or another. So again, I don't think you and I are agreeing or disagreeing on that many things. What does that? I don't know. What do you think? Am I talking out of my ass here?
No, I just think that in a way you've disproved your own point, because the thing I think you want to say is that political leaders matter, or that individuals matter. And this in some ways is like the big question of geopolitics, because the point at which geopolitics usually loses its ability to predict or to analyze is the moment that it becomes too dismissive. But I think the point here is Deadwood was going to be annexed one way or another. And that didn't, Swearengen wasn't going to stop that. Hearst wasn't going to stop that. They all recognized that they weren't going to be able to stop that.
Sure.
So on like that broadest geopolitical level, and that is the story that Deadwood is a part of, right? Like the United States slowly subsuming its much weaker enemies, the Sioux, the Mexicans, all of these, subduing them all in order to take over to the West and get to the Pacific. That's going to happen either way. Now, where individual political leaders do matter is in the day-to-day experience of individuals, right? Like the people in Deadwood themselves are massively affected by Al and Hearst competing. They're massively affected when Hearst brings in all of these Cornish and this, that, or the other types of workers, right? They're massively affected when Hearst has one Chinese guy that he wants to work with, whereas Swearengen has one Chinese guy that he wants to work with. But in the grand scheme of things, not that much was going to change, right? Like what's at stake here is who gets to profit from Deadwood and in what way, and nothing really else.
Well, I'm not sure if. First of all, I'm not sure if I know exactly what you mean, but let me throw this out there. Then, I mean, at the very beginning, not the very beginning, excuse me. Initially, Swearengen sort of quote unquote wins, right? He parries off the United States. He kind of maneuvers Hearst and gains a little bit of favor of him, and he does get the camp annexed on his terms, right? So the decisions that he made benefited him and therefore benefited the community, right? But
I think that's exactly where we break down, though, because I don't see how it benefits the community. And in the end, Hearst really wins because what Hearst wants is the money, and Hearst comes out of there with all the gold.
But my point is, he wasn't pitted against Hearst until he won that initial round. And I note this in the piece. He won the battle but lost the war. And at the time, sure, it definitely did benefit the community because it benefited all the, whatever you want to call it, the titans of the community who kind of kept law, what semblance of law there was, and order in there, right? The people who ran the post offices, the doctor, the editor in chief of the Deadwood Pioneer, all those other people, like those, they don't speak for everybody. Obviously, they weren't elected in any sort of election because elections hadn't actually taken place yet. But I'm saying that as the jump from, because Swearengen's interests aligned with the communities to some degree. This is not absolute, obviously, but because as he went, so did the camp, and vice versa. That's what I mean by the community benefits. You're right. Ultimately, it did not, and that's the point of the piece, is that he won the battle, but he lost the war because he didn't fully understand like the source of power there. And had he understood that, he might have been able to leverage that more effectively against Hearst who was already formidable by the time he got there, but he didn't. And it was his mistake that basically forfeited the community.
Yeah, I would even go one step further and say that the Swearengen character comes off, completely interest based and does some awful things throughout the course of the show,
Yeah,
so that you think
awful.
that he's an awful guy. But there is a streak of sentimentality and a streak of, I don't want to call it weakness. He has emotional loyalties that affect the way that he does things. He is simply not as brutal as somebody like Hearst is going to be, and that is why one of the things I would expect in the Deadwood movie is I would expect the Deadwood movie to be about Al Swearengen's demise, because I don't think that Al's position is sustainable, in part because he decided not to be as cutthroat as Hearst. And in some ways, I mean, and this is one of the things that you developed, right? Like the people who were there at the very beginning, they're all interest based and they want freedom and they want no laws, right? Until somebody like Bill Hickok gets killed. And then they want a trial, right? Or until
Right,
somebody tries to
exactly.
take something away from them that they can't get. And then they want the rules. And even somebody as vicious as Swearengen, over the, as you said, over the short course of the show, he becomes a little bit of a softie, right? He starts to compromise just a little bit on things because he has favorites and he has people that he likes. And that begins to flip when he faces somebody like Hearst, who doesn't give a damn about anyone and is just going to take it because he is this elemental force.
Yeah, he admits that when he refrains from putting an end to Bullock in that one scene.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't because he thought Bullock was like a swell guy. He did it because he just found out that Bullock had political ties to Montana.
No, but it was also he saw, remember he made eye contact with Bullock's stepson or whatever. And was
fair. That's fair. Yeah. I think it is partly true.
There's twinges of humanity throughout, which what's part of what makes Swearengen such a good anti-hero is you kind of like him.
The last thing I would say about that too is that when you think about what the movie might be about, right? I kind of left this open-ended in the piece. I think it doesn't. It won't matter that much, right? So my whole thing is that Swearengen won the battle, lost the war to Hearst, but it almost doesn't matter. Again, insofar as this is sort of an analog to like colonialism in the real world, right? Even if Swearengen and his camp, or Swearengen and his crew, can retake the camp from Hearst, which is probably unlikely, right? But let's just suppose for a second they can. Like, that puts you that regresses you, like that you go so far back in the different direction, because the community that they would be taking over is not necessarily the community that they would have quote unquote organically built. And I say I'm using scare quotes because no community is really that organic, right? But they would be in charge of another one. And we've seen in real life time and again, just because the oppressed get rid of their oppressors, it's not like that waves a magic wand and you're like, okay, things are cool now. Like, it takes a long time to develop that, even in what you might call successful experiments where successful experiments where colonies get rid of their colonialists, such as the United States. Like, there are still problems that linger from that. Slavery was still a problem, guns rights are still a problem, states' rights are still a problem, like expansion, legal, like all these things. So it takes a really, really long time for that to wash away. And to some degree, I think that damage is irreparable. That's my opinion. And you might disagree with that or think that I'm like an idiot or naive, but that's kind of where I'm thinking Deadwood goes, if that makes any sense.
I just hope the movie is 20 hours long, because there's so much left unsaid.
Really. I wish they had just done 6 more seasons of the HBO show.
Yeah, they didn't. I read about it a long time ago, so I don't really remember.
He wanted to do a fourth.
Yeah, and the people in charge of programming at HBO supposedly did too, but then there were some office politics, and the guy who was the corporate guy who was sort of in charge of it, I think he got fired or something, and the creator, David Milch, he's a very creative type, and I think he had some personality clashes with some of them. So yeah, for those of you who have not seen the show, like, season 3 sort of ends, but there's really no resolution because everybody assumed it would be coming back. It was critically a very successful show. I don't know, if how popular it was. Like, it's certainly no Game of Thrones, but it was a pretty popular show in its time. So there was every intention of making more episodes. It just sort of went away. It just kind of like fizzled out, and that's why weirdo fans such as us have been clamoring for this for a really long time and are really excited that it's going to be re-released.
So go back and watch with the subtitles on.
Okay, well, before we get out of here, Cole, I think I did a good job of asking questions, but is there anything that you wanted to say going in that you didn't get a chance to say that you want people to know about this piece or about geopolitics in Deadwood or just about anything in particular?
Not really. There's a lot of there are a lot of avenues I could have pursued. It was already really long and really indulgent. It was a hard piece to write because I think more so than Dune or Game of Thrones, our previous pieces, similar pieces for April Fools. This one is much more expositional. I had to recount a lot more plot than I originally intended to because you kind of have to if you want to understand these people's intentions and how what they did failed or did not fail and why they were doing it under the circumstances they were doing it in. And there's a lot of really cool social commentary in this show, especially when it comes to minority communities. Slavery was still an issue back then. I mean, this is after the Civil War, so African Americans were liberated, but as we see in the show, like not so. But they were still able to kind of find their place in this community to some degree or another, even though racism was totally a real thing. The issue of suffrage. There are some really interesting female characters and different migratory communities to pursue more about the Chinese expatriates. There were a lot of possibilities I could have taken, and ultimately there just wasn't time or real estate. And to some degree, some of this stops being geopolitical pretty quickly. But so there are some things that I have a few regrets on or whatever. I'm mostly happy with it, but again, it did get very, very, very plot driven to the extent.
It's a really good piece, Cole.
Well, no, I appreciate it, but at the end,
it also it's just really good.
The end also kind of makes it seem like I'm recounting a plot, but really I'm kind of just making this up from some of the research that I've done. So it was anyway. I liked it. It was really fun doing it. I'm obviously a really big fan of Deadwood, so everybody should read it and tell me how much more correct I am than Jacob is.
Read it with the subtitles on.
Yeah, read the piece with the subtitles on.
Yeah, maybe at some point Ian McShane will actually hear this podcast episode and he will agree to do an audio reading of your piece itself that we can publish as a separate podcast.
Man, I'd listen to that guy. Something? I'd listen to that guy read his grocery list. Got such a cool voice.
But before we get out of here, I think all three of us had the urge to use curse words on the podcast today and felt that decorum suggested that we shouldn't. So I would just ask the listeners out there, if you get this far into this podcast, if you aren't already asleep, tell us if we should curse or not, because I feel like we should probably just use the occasional curse word, but there's something about the medium, something about professionalism here that says that we shouldn't. And I would be curious how listeners would interact.
We can curse in Chinese if it makes it go down better.
As Jacob and Phillip can attest, this is actually a really, really hard thing for me to do every time I go on the podcast. I curse like a sailor. I think I've got a pretty filthy mouth. And it's always very difficult for me to hold back and say some of the things I want to say. So I'm also very restrained. And anyway, this isn't a podcast about all of us, but I just want to say I want to cuss a lot more. So please let me.
Okay, well, that was Cole, and that was Phillip.
You can cut all that. God
damn it. No. I'm going to keep some of that. That was Cole. That was Phillip. I'm Jacob. This was our special April Fool's edition, so don't worry, back to our regularly scheduled geopolitical programming as soon as, well, there's probably other stuff going on site on Monday too that is completely not Deadwood related, so check us out online. I think I'll also try and include link backs to both the Game of Thrones and the Dune pieces into the description here, because Game of Thrones is actually coming back too, so it's a good time to brush up on your geopolitics of Game of Thrones, and we've got you covered there, and Dune is just always interesting. But
they're coming out with a new Dune movie too, I think maybe next year, and they've got a lot of really, really good names attached to it, acting wise, technically wise. The director is awesome. So if there's never been a good Dune adaptation, and maybe we'll get one in our lifetimes.
And, just we've actually gotten overwhelmingly positive responses to these April Fool's pieces. That's why we keep doing them. George, I think, thought I was crazy the first time we tried to do Game of Thrones, but they've done really well so far, and we really enjoy producing them. So if you're just finding us through this podcast, check us out, geopoliticalfutures.com. Leave a review of the podcast. We bring the same level of wit and insight into geopolitics and international affairs every day, right, guys?
That is exactly
And
correct.
cursing.
And cursing. All right, thank y'all.
We're out.
Bye.
Peace. Thanks again for listening to this Geopolitical Futures podcast. Before we sign off, we forgot to mention that Stacey Heron did a lot of the graphics for the Deadwood piece, and they are wonderful. They're incredible maps for this piece, and we just wanted to give her a shout out here on the podcast before we closed off. Also wanted to say that the intro and outro music is by Jason Shaw. We felt we needed something a little more Deadwood appropriate rather than our usual upbeat thing. The first piece is appropriately called Hoedown, and the second, I think, is appropriately called Serenity. So thanks again for listening. Check us out at geopoliticalfutures.com, and we'll see you out there.